What I'd like to do is to say a little bit about the life and work of Rudolf Steiner, and to put especially the education in the context of other things which he did. So, for those of you who haven't seen him before, that's a picture of the man. You can see his dates there. Why I've done this is because often as educators we think that Steiner's main contribution was in the field of education, whereas if I was giving this talk to other people, whether it be farmers or doctors or architects or people who work in aspects of politics, we would also be able to talk about the work of Steiner in quite a significant way. Education was by far was not at all the only thing which he did. That's a question for today. He also he often illustrated his lectures with blackboard drawings. That's one of them. They are, I find, as works of art, really quite stunning. So that's one from 1923. You can see there where Steiner was born. It is in what is now Croatia. Often he's thought of as German, but he wasn't. It was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's what the map of Europe looked in the middle of the 19th century. You can see that Germany is a different shape, and Austria-Hungary no longer exists. But that is as it were the map of Europe when Steiner was growing up. He moved around significantly within Austria-Hungary when he was little, and he went to German-speaking schools, but it's quite possible he also spoke other languages. I've never read anything by him about that, but I did read an article a while ago which was called Rudolf Steiner Linguist, which was interesting. That is the house where he was born. As you see, it's quite modest. His father worked on the railways. He was the eldest of three, and he was sent just to local schools wherever his father was based at the station. You can think that in the 1860s, living and working by a station might have been similar to living and working by an airport. It was really as technological as you got. He wasn't sent to high school, to grammar school, which would have led him towards one of the better universities. He just went to a normal village or small town school, which more put people into the trades. That's a picture of one of his schools in Neudörfel, and when he was 13, the need to earn some money, I suppose like lots of 13-year-olds, grew, so he taught himself Latin and Greek and accountancy so he could teach older children and thereby earn some pocket money. He then went to university. He went to Vienna State University, which is like a poly, and took maths, chemistry and physics. Apocryphally, the university invented a new grade for his work. You get a C, a B, an A, or a Steiner, because he was very able. That ability really comes out when he was 21, and he was asked whether he would edit a new edition of Goethe's scientific writings. When you don't come from an elite university, when you're 21 anyway, that really is quite a privilege to be drawn from the whole of the German-speaking world at 21 to edit Goethe. He did that while also earning some money as a private tutor, and then at 27 he was asked to work at the Goethe archive in Weimar, which is what the picture is, on further editions of Goethe. While he was there, he edited the works of Schiller, and was asked by Nietzsche's family whether he would organise the Nietzsche archive shortly before Nietzsche died, but he turned that one down. So he worked in the archive for 12 years. His job was editing and producing books, writing prefaces, writing introductions, annotating, finding out things. As well as that, he managed to publish another 95 publications, and it really looked like Rudolf Steiner was just going to become an academic. However, at the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries, 1899, 1900, he left Weimar and he moved to Berlin, which I've written there as like Manhattan. It was really where you went in order to meet people. He sought out all kinds of people. He went to aristocratic salons. He hung out with the poets, with the philosophers, with the anarchists. They all were based around different cafes. And he writes in his autobiography later that at this time he really is trying to find some people who he can engage with, who might be responsive to some of his ideas. Those ideas were ones which he'd worked on during his time in the archive, but had never mentioned to anybody. He writes that since he was young, he has lived in two different worlds, a physical one which everybody else sees, but also what he calls a spiritual world. And he said that for him that was more real than the everyday physical world. And for this, he's almost 40 at this time. He hadn't been able to talk to anyone about it apart from one or two people who we don't know an awful lot about. And at nearly 40, he's wanting to step out and actually start speaking about some of the things which he experiences. And so, in trying to find his people, so to speak, he goes and mixes with loads of other people. In doing this, he blows his academic credentials completely. You can imagine it would be quite interesting to do it now. To do it in 1900 was relatively scandalous, I suppose, and what he was wanting to do was, his thought, if I could put it in a nutshell, was, I know that I experience this. If, as someone who's scientifically trained, this is true, this is my experience, I must be able to prove it. And proof involves being able to do things and having this and getting the same result every time. And so he spent his time in the archive, and also likely before, trying to work out to his own satisfaction what it was he was experiencing, actually investigating himself, and also trying to work out the means by which he could intensify, make clearer his own experiences. When he was in Berlin, he then came across the Theosophical Society. It's an international society based in India. And there he did find an audience who was receptive to what he was saying. He quickly became a significant speaker within the Theosophical Society and lectured all around Europe under their umbrella. That's a picture of him looking particularly exhausted. He then broke with the Theosophical Society in 1913 and founded his own society, the Anthroposophical Society, which had its centenary just a little while ago. With the new society, there was a need, or a perceived need, for, as it were, a headquarters, a central point which the society and the work of Steiner could begin to focus around. He was offered a piece of land outside Basel in Switzerland, above a little village called Dornach, and he designed his own building. That's a photo of it. He didn't have any architecture training, but he managed to design a wooden dome as big as St. Peter's in the Vatican, and it was built significantly by hand. It's made of wood there, apart from the concrete foundations, and it was built over the years of the First World War. You can see there that largely women are working by hand on what would become capitals at the top of the large columns in the main hall. There'll be mainly women because other men would, you presume, be at war. There are evidently 2 New Zealanders also in Dornach at that time. That's then one of the Finnish capitals being hoisted up. You can see the scale of the building inside. That's it, getting its capping off ceremony. It isn't only one enormous dome; it's actually 2 interlocking domes. The larger one was the auditorium, and the smaller one was above the stage. These are some early photos of the inside. The roof, the inside of the cupola was hand painted, and that's looking from the auditorium into the stage space. That's it from the approach. You can see for something which was built in the second decade of the 20th century, it's quite an astonishing building. It's the roof is looking shiny. It's shingles, so it's a wooden roof as well. There it is in context. Steiner also went on to design some of these buildings. You can see all of which are still there. What isn't there is the first Goetheanum. It burnt down. I always like to think that that's Steiner. I've actually no idea. If it is, it's a particularly poignant photo. You're taken from the hill above, and you can see the building is absolutely destroyed. This was a severe blow, as you can imagine, when the whole thing had been built by hand. And I'm sure it was also extremely demoralizing, but he immediately began work on a second Goetheanum, which is the one which is there now. The first one was built on donated land. It was built by donated labour, and it was also out of a living material, wood. The funding for the second one came from insurance money, and Steiner said no, that the insurance money is, as it were, dead. We can't build out of wood because we're using dead money. So it's made out of concrete. It's also it's a stunning building. It regularly gets mentioned in architecture magazines and programs and books. That's just the approach. It's mainly works as a conference venue now. It's got an enormous hall and several smaller halls, as well as hosting offices and a bookshop and the archive and things. The style of this informally is known as blob architecture, which isn't very complimentary. The more formal term is organic, and it's proven a influential style. That was it a few weeks ago. I'd never seen it in the snow. The windows of the main auditorium are coloured, which then give coloured shadows, which is pretty interesting to be in coloured shadows. That's a picture of the main hall, also with a hand-painted roof. It is bigger than it looks. It seats about 1,000, And yeah, that's from the stage. When you're at the top looking down, it, as it were, feels much, much bigger than that looks. At the same time as he was designing the first Goetheanum, he was also working on a series of 4 plays, which he called the mystery dramas. Mystery as in medieval mystery plays. He was then helped by his second wife. He was a widower. He married young, and his first wife died. There she is, Marie Steiner. She was an actress. I think someone with a very, very forceful will. And she was his greatest supporter. This is a shot I found from one of the mystery dramas. The idea is that you follow the path of some normal everyday characters, but given Steiner's interest in the spiritual world, he wanted to portray on the stage what happens as well. What happens when, as an individual, you are being tempted. I think that's some temptation which we're seeing here. And so at the same time as everyday happenings, you are seeing all these spiritual beings moving in the background. I find them as plays, when I read them, almost impossible to access. When I've seen excerpts of them on the stage, they are, I think, the most dramatic things I've ever seen in my life. They need staging, they aren't for reading. He was at the same time working on a sculpture group, which he called a representative of the human being, representative of man. This is then a central figure with one hand raised, one hand down. You can see it in the context of the whole group here. If you remember Steiner himself, so Steiner's head was on a level, his feet were on a level with the waist. So you're looking at a vast sculpture, an awful lot of carving. It's not finished, as you can see. Particularly the lower section is the most finished. It is representing the human being, as it were, standing between 2 opposing forces. One, this lower one, is the force of materialism, being bound down to matter, and the other one is the force of I want to say airy-fairiness, being, as it were, being pulled away from matter, so you exist, you're spinning in your own head. And how a grounded human being has both to has to balance materialism, but also being drawn out to the other pole. This group was meant to stand at the back of the stage of the first Goetheanum, but it wasn't finished when the building burnt down, so fortunately it's still there. It's got its own building now. That's then a close-up of the lower figure,